Brianna, I missed you last Sunday. I can't remember exactly what it was I wanted to ask you at coffee hour, but I looked around and noticed that you were absent and wondered where you were. I'm glad to know that you were worshiping elsewhere. And part of why I miss Brianna is that Unitarian Universalism and the community we create here at the Fellowship are dependent on you. Not just to be a warm body or put dollars in the offering plate, but as a shaping, driving force behind our faith. Okay, but before we get to your commissioning as prophets, let me back up. Unitarian Universalism is a really long name. But that name, at its core, points to an equally long history of people who have been free thinkers, justice seekers, and believers in the transformative power of love. We have two branches of our family tree. The Unitarian side of things is the history that points us toward the prominent role that reason, study, and free thinking have in our identity. That heritage, which fascinatingly sprung out of the early Puritan churches in New England, you don't get to pick your families, has included many iterations of what it means to be Unitarian. First, it meant a version of Protestant Christianity that rejected the Trinity and affirmed that Jesus was only as human or as godlike as the rest of us. Then Unitarianism came to encompass an increasingly mystical understanding of the world around us through writers and ministers who used the label transcendentalist. And centuries before you went tubing on the Peshtigo, Brianna, Unitarian minister Ralph Waldo Emerson suggested that people ought to skip church and hang out in the woods. Sometimes it's a rough heritage to work against as a minister. As I told the 9 o'clock service, sometimes I pray for rain and 55 degrees on Sunday morning. And then, at the dawn of the 20th century, Unitarianism began to encompass humanism and atheism. They saw themselves as free thinkers bound by the values that Jesus taught rather than by Jesus' theology. And then there's the Universalist branch of the family tree. And that's the one that points us toward that unfolding story of love in our world in which each and every person has a place. Universalism first emerged from both the American and English evangelical movements. We don't get to pick our families. Protestants here and across the pond began to find a place for deep emotion and ecstatic practice in their Christianity, and some of them, out of that sense of deep feeling, began to preach that God's love was so big that it would save everybody, and nobody would be condemned to eternal punishment. They called themselves Universalists, as in God's universal love and salvation. And as the years went on, these Universalists, some of them began to say, you know what, there kind of is a hell, but it was the pain and suffering we create for one another here on earth and in this life. And so many of them became influential social reformers in the 1800s in our country. Out of that sense of, I am called to love the hell out of this world. And Universalists, like their Unitarian counterparts, began to crack open beyond Christianity in the first half of the 20th century as they explored what universalism, what that sense of a universal love would mean if it moved beyond the traditional Christian cosmology, right, where there's an all-powerful God involved. Then, starting in the 1920s through the 1950s, Unitarians and Universalists began to share resources and have things like combined youth groups and women's auxiliaries. And then in 1961, the Unitarians and the Universalists officially consolidated into the Unitarian Universalist Association that our fellowship is still part of today. And over the last 50 years or so in Unitarian Universalism, we have integrated pagan, earth-centered, and religious naturalist approaches into how we understand our faith's unfolding. And we gather today as a religious community bound not by shared theology, but by shared values: justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity, that shape how we create a faith home where love is always at the center. And while some early Unitarian or Universalist ministers, the ones who weren't that far removed from the Puritans or the evangelical Christian movement, they might be a little aghast that a tattooed lesbian religious naturalist with an alternative lifestyle haircut, who doesn't even have the decency to wear a robe when she preaches, and sometimes she swears in meetings. It's okay, my children are in their religious exploration classes, so they don't hear that. Right? That they might be a little aghast that people like me, that I am now one of the standard bearers for this religion. But the truth is that we are the inheritors of their gifts. Reason as a primary tool of spiritual formation, a love so big that nobody can ever be outside of it, and the idea that revelation is unsealed, that our relationship to truth is unfolding and ongoing. And that last one is where you all come in. Because Unitarian Universalism didn't undergo all of these changes because some prophet showed up and said, "I have received a vision. We're going to be humanists now." That's not how it happened. And Unitarian Universalism didn't change because some saint convinced everybody that their mystical experience meant that suddenly there's truth beyond the Bible. And Unitarian Universalism didn't change because one day a single charismatic pagan showed up and said they're in charge. Sorry to any aspiring pagan cult leaders in the room. Despite what you may have heard from the religious right, we are not, in fact, a place that is a fully pagan cult. Unitarian Universalism changed, and it is changing now, today, because people have shown up again and again to our movement with open hearts and open minds and pursued a religious community that assumes that seekers and their doubts are an asset rather than a threat. Unitarian Universalism has changed because it has lived the truth that we are all prophets, all capable of pointing us in a new direction as part of a community. Doubts, questions, wonder, free inquiry, learning, possibility, they all point to that smooth stone from James Luther Adams. That revelation, truth, our ability to know something greater than ourselves is evolving. Not that it has no real definition, not that it can be whatever you want it to be, but that we believe that the world is in motion, that we as individuals are in motion. And so our understanding of our spiritual and religious identity ought to be in motion too. As a Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, is that it, Mike? Yes. I have my pronunciation experts in the congregation that I sometimes consult. Right? That he probably gave us the phrase, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." Meaning that the change is not just one or the other, it's both. And goodness, we don't have to look very hard right now to see what happens when your worldview is static, fixed, and calcified from a time that no longer exists, if it ever even did in the first place. And these rigid worldviews are increasingly brittle, unable to sustain dissent, disagreement, or the true diversity of human experience. Instead, those with these brittle worldviews declare that anything that challenges their understanding of the world is un-American, un-Christian, terrorists. And right now, so many of us, as those with these rigid worldviews, tighten their grip on power, are so afraid, and understandably so. The risk that has long been borne by the most vulnerable among us, trans folks whose identities have only just recently started to be legally protected meaningfully, our immigrant neighbors who have been subject to the horrors of the US deportation machine for years before Donald Trump was even a candidate for president. That risk now lives freely and in the open, marching down the streets dressed up as security. And so it is in this context, in this climate, in this moment, being part of a Unitarian Universalist community like this one here at the Fellowship means claiming a religious identity that holds evolving, unsealed revelation, evolving truth as a core teaching. And it feels important here for me to distinguish from some of our mainline or liberal Christian siblings who do hold a more progressive faith lens that allows for some more change. But my experience of them is that for them, openness to change as a practice is sort of auxiliary to their primary truth in the revealed teachings of Jesus. And I am so grateful for those progressive Christian friends and neighbors. They are some of my ride or dies, truly. But being part of a community where openness to change is a lens through which you view your faith, that's not the same as a religious community where the baseline expectation is that we will not leave this the same faith we found it. Which is why we need you, each of you. Not because we have cornered the market on truth and want to convince you to buy in, but because Unitarian Universalism thrives when people bring the fullness of themselves and their lives to this faith and refuse to let it rest, refuse to let this community rest as it is. And man, what an urgent and countercultural undertaking right now to proclaim that we want a spiritual community where authority is challenged, sharpened, and every day remade in the image of love, as best we can understand it for our time. And it wouldn't be very Unitarian of me if I told you to disobey Ralph Waldo Emerson. So sometimes you gotta go tubing on the river instead of coming to service. But the rest of the time, we need you. We need your presence. Whether this is your first time here or your 500th, Your presence here keeps us in motion. Next Sunday, if you come back, the river you step in will be different than the one you found today. And I hope you're not the same either. I wouldn't want it any other way. May it be so.